On the morning of my 19th birthday, I walked away from St. Catherine's Home for Children, carrying my entire life in a canvas sack, $217 in wadded cash, a freshly printed diploma, and zero clue where I was heading. The spring wind slapped my cheeks as the heavy security doors latched shut for the final time. I lingered on the cement stairs, peering through the glass at the other kids finishing their cereal. A few raised a hand. Most kept their heads down. They understood the drill. Once the system spits you out, you turn into a phantom. You become a memory of someone who used to share their air. Linda, my caseworker, had done her level best to get me ready. She burned months drilling me on budgeting, filling out applications, and navigating the banking maze. She armed me with printouts of safety nets, shelters, food pantries, highlighting the lifelines in neon yellow. But no curriculum prepares you for the suffocating pressure of absolute solitude. There is no handout that tells you how to breathe when it hits you, truly hits you. That not a single soul on earth is required to give a damn if you wake up tomorrow. My first night of independence was spent in a roadside motel near Brattleboro. The drywall was so paper thin I could audit the neighbors' financial arguments. Water stains mapped out imaginary countries on the ceiling plaster. The room reeked of stale tobacco and harsh industrial bleach. I lay on the gritty duvet tracing those ceiling shapes, terrified that this was my new forever. Hollow, drifting, invisible. I had a strategy or the bones of one. Find work. Any paycheck, hoard cash, rent a studio, construct a life that looked somewhat standard. It seemed doable back in the safety of Linda's office. Her optimistic nodding convinced me I had a shot. Reality dismantled that hope in 7 days. I papered the town with applications. The Route 9 filling station, the market with the twitchy neon sign. 3 burger joints, even the library where a gray-haired lady took my paper and promised a callback. Her eyes held that soft pity she couldn't quite mask. The phone never rang. The roadblock was always the same. No fixed address, 0 references barring a social worker and a resume that listed nothing but dish duty at a group home. I was a ghost in the machine, asking strangers to bet on a girl with no digital footprint, no safety net, no one to say, she's good for it. That $217, stretched for 11 days of severe rationing, gas station sandwiches and cellophane, complimentary coffee from the Main Street church. Nights spent curled in the back seat of my rusted Honda Civic when the motel cash ran dry, bundled in a donated sleeping bag from St. Catherine's. I showered at the local YMCA until the day pass fee ate too much into my food budget. After that, it was bird baths in service station restrooms, splashing cold water and scrubbing with rough paper towels, desperate to look hireable. The shame sat in my gut like a stone, but I kept telling myself this was just a phase. A break had to come. Just hang on. 3 weeks post-departure from St. Catherine's fate took a sharp left turn. I was idling in that same church lot where I poached morning coffee. The Reverend had clocked me by then. He started leaving bagged lunches in the hall with notes reading, "For whomever takes them." We both knew the score. I was too proud to say thanks, but too starving to walk away. My phone buzzed right after 12. Unknown number. I picked up anyway, having scattered those digits across a 30-mile radius, praying for a job offer. "Is this Wren?" The voice was female, polished and clinically professional. "Yeah, this is Wren. My name is Vivian Ashford. I am an attorney based in Burlington. I am calling concerning the estate of Harriet Calloway." I pulled the mobile away, staring at the screen. Sure, I'd lost the plot. Estate attorney. That vocabulary belonged to a different world. "I'm sorry, you must have the wrong number." "You are Wren, right? You left St. Catherine's Home for Children roughly 3 weeks ago." Ice flooded my veins. "How do you know that Ms. Calloway's will was extremely precise?" Vivian Ashford replied. "I need a face-to-face meeting regarding an inheritance. Can you meet this week?" A bitter laugh almost escaped me. My calendar was just devoid of empty days. But the word inheritance didn't track. I had no kin, no holiday cards from distant aunts, no long-lost family who would even know my name, let alone leave me anything. The name Harriet Calloway rang 0 bells. "I get why you're confused, but hold tight until I see you. Could you make it to Burlington this Tuesday? My practice is on College Street." Every alarm bell I'd installed over 19 years in state care started blaring fraud. I figured a shark had spotted a lonely, desperate kid and planned to shake me down for bogus processing fees or imaginary taxes. They'd siphon off every last dime I had and then vanish like smoke. Yet Vivian Ashford's tone carried a weight of truth official solid, like discovering a hidden room in a house you thought you knew. "Okay," the word slipped out. "I'll be there Tuesday." The trek to Burlington ate up 2 hours on twisting Vermont asphalt. Green peaks walled in the highway, their summits still clinging to snow patches despite it being late March. I rolled past timberland and pastures, cruising through tiny hamlets marked by bleached church spires. The whole way I practiced the shrug I'd give when this turned out to be a waste of gas. Ashford's firm was housed in a heavy, old-world brick structure downtown. It was one of those hushed spaces with soaring glass and gleaming floors that make you instinctively tread lightly. An assistant guided me to a boardroom fitted with plush leather and a backdrop of Lake Champlain shimmering far off. Vivian was waiting. She looked to be in her early 60s, steel gray hair, fastened tight reading spectacles suspended on a chain against her chest. She rose as I walked in, offering a handshake that meant business and a cup of coffee. I took it. My stomach was empty, save for a stale pack of vending machine crackers I'd wolfed down that morning. "Appreciate you coming," she murmured, sinking back into her seat. Her palms rested on a thick dossier like she was guarding a secret that could tilt the Earth's axis. "I'm still in the dark here. What is this about?" Vivian gave a measured nod. "Harriet Calloway raised sheep. Her land sits in the hills near Huntington, maybe 40 minutes out. She was a private soul, yet a fixture in the valley. Steady, gentle, the sort who'd pull your truck out of a ditch and wave off a thank you. You follow. She passed 6 weeks back, 78. Her heart gave out while she was tending the barn. No partner, no kids, not a single blood relation on the map. I sat silent, clutching the ceramic mug for warmth. She revised her testament 2 years ago. She bequeathed her entire estate to the very next youth to age out of St. Catherine's home following her death. The syllables floated in the air. I caught them one by one. Next kid, aged out, St. Cat's, but my brain refused to stitch them into a picture. "That doesn't track," I stammered. Vivian's gaze softened. "Harriet was a ward of the state just like you. She spent her adulthood scraping together a sanctuary from zero. She intended to offer that stability to another survivor starting from the bottom. But she never met me. No? So why give me anything?" Vivian unclasped the file and pushed a document toward me. It was a Xerox of a note penned by hand, the lettering sharp and deliberate. She attached this reasoning to her will. I lifted the page, my grip unsteady. I understand the hollowness of having no roots. I recall the feeling of exiting a facility with your life in a sack, aware that not a soul on this earth is expecting you. I forged this homestead from that void. I carved out an existence. When I depart, I wish to grant a stranger the break I had to grant myself, not as a reward. Not due to superior merit, but because every human warrants at least one unlocked gate when every other path is barred. The room swam before me. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the tears escaped, splashing onto the mahogany surface. "The estate covers 63 acres. Vivian went on, her tone hushed. "A 2-story main house requiring repairs, a substantial barn, various sheds, and a herd of roughly 140 sheep. I stared at her, my voice box paralyzed. "There is also a cash reserve of nearly $18,000. It will handle taxes and essentials for a year or so if you budget wisely." She dipped into the file and brought out a keyring. Ancient brass rubbed soft and golden by decades of fingers. She pushed them over. They clinked against the timber, a tiny noise that rang loud in the silence. "It belongs to you now, Wren. Every stone Harriet Calloway laid. It was her wish." I accepted the metal with trembling fingers and left the building feeling as though I had walked onto a movie set by mistake. The route to the property led me down back roads I'd never seen. Ancient stone boundaries bordered the asphalt stacked by laborers long since returned to dust. Giant sugar maples loomed above their limbs, just starting to display the first faint verdure of spring. The tires crunched onto the gravel access road, and I killed the engine immediately, needing a minute just to breathe and absorb the reality of the scene. Perched on the crest, the main house wore a coat of white siding accented by hunter green window frames. It commanded a view of the undulated landscape, a sea of hills stretching out until they blurred into the horizon. Sure, the finish was flaking and the veranda dipped a bit to the left, but the bones were good. The place had a defiant posture, like an old fighter who'd taken every hit the weather could throw and refused to go down. Nearby stood the barn, a titan of faded crimson masonry and wood silhouetted boldly against the waning afternoon light. Green paddocks, neatly hemmed in by wire, flanked the approach on both wings. And the residents were there. More than 100 of them drifted across the turf like grounded cumulus clouds, their ivory fleece glowing in the golden hour. A handful paused their grazing to inspect the noise of my arrival, but the majority ignored me, completely unfazed by the new landlord. It was without question the most breathtaking sight I'd ever witnessed. Simultaneously, a cold panic set in as I was city-soft and clueless about husbandry or land management. The prospect of running this operation solo seemed impossible, so steeling myself, I keyed the lock and pushed into the foyer. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of hickory smoke and aging paper. A comforting inhabited aroma filled with utilitarian pieces rather than fancy decor. An exhausted leather sofa stared down a rock hearth, while the dining area held mismatched seating and bookcases groaning under the weight of agricultural guides with broken bindings. Framed memories cluttered the mantelpiece, mostly prize-winning livestock at regional exhibitions, complete with first-place rosettes attached to the glass. Scenic shots captured the property's evolution through the calendar. Buried in January drifts amber in October and emerald in July. Yet there wasn't a single portrait of a birthday party or a Christmas gathering. Harriet Calloway had spent the better part of her life in these rooms completely on her own. She had constructed her existence in solitude, a path I was now destined to walk. Walking into the galley, I spotted a piece of paper anchored by a ceramic cup. The script was sharp and jagged, matching the correspondence I'd seen earlier reading, "To the new keeper, consider this a fresh start. The soil has treated me with kindness, and it will offer you the same courtesy provided you put in the sweat and remain teachable. Drop your pride and seek assistance when necessary. As for the flock, they are vocal about their requirements. Pay attention. I've left a comprehensive logbook in the outbuilding office. Claim this sanctuary, you've earned it." The signature was brief, Harriet. I scanned the message 3 times before creasing it along the lines and tucking it into my jeans, where it remained for seasons, the fibers eventually turning velvety from my nervous fingers. Exiting the back door, I headed for the stables to confront the living creatures that were suddenly under my charge. The interior was cavernous, the rafters stretching up into the gloom, swallowed by darkness above rows of enclosures lining the perimeter, while the air hung heavy with dried grass lanolin and the ancient musk of the earth. It was the perfume of 1,000 lives that had passed through that corridor. While the main herd grazed outdoors, a few stragglers remained inside, and one in particular was isolated in a compact stall adjacent to the administrative room. He didn't look like the others. Where his peers boasted pristine, voluminous fleece, this fellow was scruffy, his coat knotted and stained. He was gaunt, with the cage of his ribs pushing against his messy hide. It was his gaze that stopped me cold, deep, knowing eyes tracked my movement with a startlingly human level of awareness. There was no fear or anger there, only interest and a hint of melancholy. And I noticed a chart hook on the gate bearing Harriet's distinct scrawl. Bold letters at the header announced his identity, Walter. The record detailed his history, a bummer lamb kicked away by the ewe at birth. Harriet had raised him by hand, causing him to imprint on people rather than his biological kin. Consequently, the herd viewed him as an outsider and refused to integrate him. He didn't speak their language, and currently he was in quarantine for a bacterial hoof infection, explaining his solitary confinement. The final log, penned 48 hours prior to Harriet's passing, noted, "Walter is improving. Reintroduction scheduled for next week. Watch him closely, he is unique." I extended a hand over the rail, and Walter approached immediately. He nudged his forehead into my hand, and the texture was abrasive, far more bristly than the cotton ball softness I'd imagined. He let out a low, quiet bleat, a murmur that felt less like a noise and more like a greeting. Lingering there in his twilight fingers buried in the fur of an outcast, the weight of Harriet's words clicked into place. Walter was my mirror. We were both discards left behind by the very people supposed to offer protection. 2 misfits staring through the glass at a society that had already closed the curtains on us. I collapsed onto a nearby stack of straw and began to speak aloud. It was irrational, maybe even crazy. But Walter didn't judge. He just stood there, head cocked, drinking in every word with a soulful, unblinking gaze. He'd let out these soft bleats, looking at me like he parsed every single syllable. I spilled my guts to him, the years in foster care, the hollow ache of homelessness, and the terror that I'd blow this chance and wind up sleeping in my sedan again, surviving on convenience store snacks. I confessed that I hadn't the faintest clue how to raise sheep. Hell, I couldn't raise anything. I was barely keeping my own head above water. Walter just held my gaze, and his steady presence somehow took the edge off the impossible mountain I was climbing. Later, I crawled into Harriet's bed, the linens still holding a ghost of lavender scent. I lay there, watching the ceiling, tuning into the alien rhythm of the countryside. the hoot of owl's wind rustling the branches and the distant murmur of the flock bedding down. I was oblivious then, but my life had barely started and the true gauntlet was still waiting for me. That first week on the land almost broke me. Day 1 began with a cacophony of bleating, a relentless alarm that screamed before dawn and didn't quit until I dragged myself out of the sheets. I threw on dirty clothes from the floor and trudged out to the barn. On paper, the feeding routine in Harriet's notebook looked straightforward. Scoop grain, toss hay, fill troughs. In practice, total anarchy. The flock mobbed me, jostling and shoving, their cries sounding less like hunger and more like an indictment. I managed to feed them eventually, even if I did dump 50% of a grain sack in the scramble and almost face-planted over a lamb that had wandered where it shouldn't have been. By the time the dust settled, the sun was high, and I was drenched in sweat despite the chill with a whole day's labor still staring me down. I dug up the vet's contact in Harriet's notes and dialed her that afternoon. Her name was Dr. Karen Bellamy, and she pulled up a few hours later in a grit-covered truck, her kit riding shotgun. She looked to be about 45, sporting a no-nonsense haircut and radiating the steady vibe of someone who's spent 20 years fixing disasters. She didn't condescend, even though my incompetence was painfully clear. Priority 1, she announced, guiding me down the aisle. Let's assess the herd and get a baseline. She demonstrated how to scan for sickness, inspect hooves for infection, and palpate abdomens to check for lambs on the way. The volume of knowledge required just to keep these creatures breathing felt crushing. Then she dropped a truth that anchored me. Harriet was in her 30s when she took over. She was green, too. The only requirement is being open to learning and too stubborn to quit when it gets rough. That eased the despair a fraction. For those initial weeks, my daily routine began with Walter. I'd freshen his straw, inspect his recovering hooves, and chatter away at him while I busied myself. He'd lean against the enclosure gate, observing me with a soulful gaze, grunting softly as if holding up his end of the conversation. I realize how absurd it sounds, confiding in livestock like he was a therapist. But honestly, Walter was a better listener than the majority of humans I've encountered. No interruptions, no accusations of being dramatic, no pitying stares. He just existed with me, offering a silent solidarity that felt real. Dr. Bellamy eventually gave him the green light to go back to the general population. I made several attempts, but whenever I reintroduced him, the herd shunned him. Occasionally, they'd give him the cold shoulder, pivoting away when he drew near. Other times, it turned violent rams, dropping their heads to batter him until he backed off. He always wound up solitary near the perimeter, while the group grazed as a unit. And the misery in his expression was too much for me to stomach. I'd herd him back to his private stall, aware I might be sabotaging his social skills, but the emotion resonated too deeply. That gut-wrenching attempt to belong only to be cast aside repeatedly. Standing on the fringe, watching connections form between everyone else while you remain unmoored. I couldn't force that on him, not when I had the ability to protect him from it. Folks from nearby farms began stopping in once the grapevine spread the news about the new owner at the Callaway estate. Hank Donnelly managed the eastern plot. He was a guy around 55 with rough, calloused hands and a soft-spoken demeanor. A man who chose his vocabulary with precision and stood by every syllable. His wife baked apple pies that were blue ribbon quality, assuming she'd ever cared to compete. Hank assisted me in repairing a span of fencing that had decayed. He taught me the ritual to crank Harriet's prehistoric tractor, a specific dance of levers, and a bit of faith. He never made me feel incompetent for being ignorant of the basics. "Everybody's a beginner once," he remarked one afternoon, cleaning oil off his palms after we finally coaxed the engine to life. Harriet arrived on this land just as bewildered as I was in the beginning. She simply relied on grit and persistence until the rhythms of the farm made sense. Her daughter Tessa told me this. At 21, she was studying agricultural commerce at the state university. Tessa carried herself with a certainty I coveted, yet she never belittled me for my ignorance of things the locals took for granted. She sat me down to organize a functional ledger for the finances, and walked me through the grant applications specifically designed for novice growers. "You have a narrative," she remarked one afternoon, scanning the paperwork we were drafting. "Committees are sentimental. They have a soft spot for redemption arcs." To the west lived Opal Brennan and her husband. At 70, with a long plait of steel-gray hair, she tended a garden that humbled every other plot in the county. One glance at my barren pantry was enough for her to start delivering fresh loaves and eggs twice a week. She drilled me on preservation techniques, adamant that I master canning before the summer harvest peaked. Yet it was Silas who became my true anchor. 23 and raised in the soil, he pulled shifts at the massive dairy operation on the southern border. He would swing by after his shift, often catching me in the middle of a disaster, and quietly lend a hand without looking for praise. We spent a weekend reconstructing the sheep pen together, after a torrential downpour caused a section of the roof to collapse. As we hammered, he spoke of his Vermont childhood, the family land lost to an older brother, and his quiet ambition to one day own a patch of earth. In turn, I opened up about St. Catherine's, about aging out of the system with nothing, and this unexpected legacy that had landed in my lap. He offered no sympathy when I spoke of my history, only his undivided attention. Then he said something that stuck with me. "Sounds like Harriet wasn't blind when she drafted that will. She needed an heir who grasped the soul of this place." It was Silas who finally leveled with me about Walter. We were resting on the veranda after a grueling shift, watching the sun dip below the ridgeline. I had been recounting another failed attempt to integrate Walter into the herd. "Hand-reared lambs rarely assimilate," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "They imprint on people, not livestock. The flock senses the anomaly. They will never truly take him in. So what is the solution? You have 3 paths. Keep him as a companion, which means isolation and a life with only you for company. Or force the issue and accept that he will likely be battered repeatedly in the process." He looked away toward the dimming pastures. "Or the third route, the one farmers take when a beast cannot thrive." My teeth clenched. "That is off the table." Silas held my gaze, then nodded slowly. "Knew you would say that." After he departed, I joined Walter in his stall. I remained silent this time, simply resting my back against the timber slats. He settled beside me, a warm weight against my shins. Outside, the flock murmured in the twilight, soft bleating and the rustle of fleece as they bedded down together. Walter and I stood apart from that world, 2 castaways finding solace in one another. I buried my hand in his wool and made a silent vow. No matter the cost, I would not abandon him. We would survive this together. The afternoon Preston Calloway showed up. I was wrestling with a broken hinge in the barn. Grime coated my hands, my hair was a mess, and I undoubtedly reeked of lanolin. I heard the engine before I saw the vehicle. A polished black luxury car, utterly alien against the gravel, trailing a cloud of dust. The man who emerged was in his mid-40s, draped in a suit worth more than my entire existence. He carried the air of a man accustomed to command, to being heard, and to seizing exactly what he desired. He scanned the fields with a gaze I could not parse. Part calculation, part something more predatory. "You must be the ward," he stated as I walked out. The label stung, but I kept my face blank. "Can I help you?" "I am Preston Calloway. Harriet was my great-aunt." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I am here to resolve the issue with this estate." "There is no issue. This land was bequeathed to me by a woman you ignored who bypassed her own blood to leave it to a stranger." He sighed patronizingly as if lecturing a toddler. "Surely you see the optics of the situation." "I see Harriet's clear intent." Preston's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. "My grandfather was her brother. The Calloway bloodline has claimed this earth for centuries. It never should have slipped through our fingers. Harriet purchased this deed with her own money, or so her attorney claims. It wasn't some heirloom passed down to her." He sneered the word attorney as if it were a punchline. "My counsel sees the matter quite differently." A chill took root deep in my gut. What is that supposed to mean? It means I am offering you a graceful exit with a payout rather than leaving you destitute. He retrieved a business card and extended it toward me. 30 days. Mull it over. We can settle this like rational adults, or we can let the judicial system grind you down. I let the card hang in the air untouched. I am staying right here. Preston's smirk vanished. You are 19. You have 0 capital, no degree, no kin, and not the faintest clue how to manage an operation like this. How long do you honestly expect to survive out here? As long as I have to. He scrutinized me, searching for a crack in the armor. He slid the card back into his coat and pivoted toward his vehicle. 30 days, he called back without turning around. After that, the litigation begins. I remained rooted in the gravel, watching his taillights fade, my pulse hammering against my windpipe. Retreating to the sanctuary of the barn, I sank into the straw of Walter's enclosure and finally allowed the tears to come. For anyone who has ever faced the threat of losing their only refuge, you understand precisely the terror gripping Wren right now. Put yourself in her boots. Would you stand your ground against a giant, or would you cut your losses and run? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't joined our community yet, please subscribe because the road ahead is about to get steep. Wren is staring down the most grueling season of her existence. Impending litigation, a sickness spreading through the flock, and a crisis that nearly claims her only companion. But before the storm breaks, she uncovers a truth about Harriet that reshapes her entire world. I reached out to Vivian Ashford first thing the following morning. She stayed silent as I poured out the details: Preston's visit, his ultimatum, and the dark cloud hovering over the life I was struggling to build. The testament is ironclad, she assured me once I went quiet. Harriet left nothing to chance. She anticipated friction and documented every decision meticulously. But can he still sue? In this country, anyone can file a complaint. Victory is another matter entirely. The line went quiet for a beat. Preston has deep pockets. He can fund a siege for years if he chooses. The real issue is whether you have the resources to withstand it. I glanced around Harriet's kitchen. The vintage stove, the wallpaper curling at the seams, the glass framing the pasture where the flock grazed in the soft morning glow. Do I really have an option? There is always a choice, Wren. But listen closely. I knew that woman for nearly 30 years. She was never impulsive. If she selected you, she had a purpose. And if you choose to defend this legacy, I will stand with you. I ended the call and sat motionless, staring into the void. Eventually, I stepped out into the air and returned to my labors. The ensuing months were a crucible, exhausting, yet redefining. I settled into a cadence that guided my existence like a riverbed guides water, awake at 5:30. Fodder for the flock and checking the expectant ewes, followed by whatever broken fence or machine required my attention, and something always did. Afternoons were for administration, navigating wool contracts, scheduling the shearers for late spring, and maintaining Harriet's precise ledgers. Nightfall usually found me back in the timber-framed barn with Walter, sometimes reciting passages from old agricultural texts, other times just resting in a companionable hush as he laid his chin on the rails and observed me. I was discovering that solitude does not necessarily equal loneliness. Not when your days are filled with duty. Not when an outcast animal seems to comprehend your soul better than people ever did. Still, I persisted in trying to reintegrate Walter into the herd. A part of me clung to the belief that with the right strategy he could belong somewhere. I devoured every article on ovine psychology I could access. I left him out in the field one night, hoping the flock might accept him in my absence. But dawn revealed him isolated by the fence blood trickling from fresh gashes where the rams had battered him. I attempted to socialize him with the yearlings, assuming their youth might make them kinder, yet they looked right through him as if he didn't exist. It tore me apart to witness. One afternoon in early June, while decluttering the office, I stumbled upon a carton I had previously overlooked. It was wedged behind a steel cabinet coated in dust and easy to miss. It contained correspondence snapshots and paperwork yellowing with age. I laid them out across the desktop and began to read. These letters dated back decades. Some were sent to Harriet from Child Welfare Services. Others bore the letterheads of attorneys managing bureaucratic affairs. But it was the photographs that made my blood run cold. A snapshot captured Harriet in her prime, likely no older than 19, posed right before this very homestead. Back then, the siding gleamed without a chip, the veranda stood straight, and her grin held a fierce sort of dignity I've occasionally glimpsed in my own reflection. I flipped through more pictures capturing her through the decades solitary, and every single one always accompanied by a flock grazing nearby. Then came the image that brought my entire universe to a screeching halt. A teenage Harriet, perhaps 16, surrounded by a cluster of other kids. Looming in the rear was a brick structure, stark and clinical, a place I knew in my bones. Tucked in the corner, a placard clung to the wall, faint yet unmistakable. St. Catherine's Home for Children. The picture slipped from my grasp. Tremors racked my fingers so violently I couldn't grip the paper. Harriet was a ward of the state. She came from that place. My place. Retrieving the photo, I peered closer at the imposing facade in the background. Identical windows. The exact same concrete stairs. Even that ancient oak anchoring the edge of the shot, the sanctuary where I used to hide, stood guard there. It was barely a sapling then, but there was no denying it was my tree. She had paced those very corridors, rested in those wireframe bunks, and choked down meals in that cafeteria with its buzzing overhead lights and scent of boiled cabbage. 6 decades prior, she must have huddled beneath those branches, drowning in the same isolation that once swallowed me whole. Eventually, she exited those gates empty-handed, mirroring my own departure. From that void, she created this sanctuary. I collapsed onto the gritty floorboards of the barn office, weeping with an intensity I hadn't felt since setting foot on this land. This wasn't grief, nor was it joy. I was crying from the shock of being truly seen of a bond forged across generations. Selecting the next heir from St. Catherine's wasn't a gamble. She picked me with intention. She understood the sensation of waiting on that porch with a trash bag of clothes and zero prospects. She was intimate with that specific brand of solitude, the way optimism decays after years of rejection and failed placements. She had lived through the darkness and wanted to prove that endurance pays off, that you can scrape together a life from the wreckage and mold it into art. Buried beneath the photos lay a note she had addressed to herself. Though the page was fragile and the script washed out, the message remained legible. Today, I am a landowner. No one can seize this. No one can claim I am an outsider. I constructed this life from scratch, and it belongs to me. One day, I will pass this opportunity forward to a soul who understands the weight of having nothing, a person who grasps the sanctity of this dirt, a child of St. Catherine's if fate allows. My story began there. I want the legacy to endure through one of us. She had been orchestrating this for 40 years. She was expecting me before I even existed, yet farm life still taught harsh tutorials. Near the end of May, a ewe succumbed to labor complications. We called her Clover. Even though I summoned Dr. Bellamy and adhered to every protocol, it wasn't enough. She faded just before dawn while I cradled her head in my lap. In her wake, she left a tiny, spindly-legged ram whose wails carried a frighteningly human tone of despair. He bleated ceaselessly for the mother who wouldn't return, rejecting sustenance and fading fast. I paced the house with him swaddled like an infant, trying every trick to coax him into nursing. Absolute failure. He just turned aside, mourning a loss he couldn't comprehend. By day, too convinced death was coming for him too, I carried him to Walter's stall. I can't say what I hoped to achieve, perhaps nothing at all. Maybe I simply couldn't bear to vigil over a dying creature in solitude. But the moment the little ram spotted Walter, the atmosphere shifted. The screaming ceased. The tension draining from his tiny frame was visible. He stared at the older animal who was so at ease with people, and some primal intuition signaled safety. He drank from the bottle that afternoon, his first true meal since being orphaned. From then on, the lamb attached himself to Walter, mirroring the bond Walter once shared with Harriet. He shadowed Walter's every step, napped buried in his fleece, and panicked if they were apart for 5 minutes. It seemed Walter finally found a companion who embraced him without condition. A soul who didn't mind his quirks. A friend who cherished him simply for existing. I christened the little guy Scout, given his penchant for investigating, always trotting a few yards ahead before sprinting back to Walter for comfort. Observing their dynamic, a vital truth crystallized for me. Outcasts often locate one another to forge their own tribe. Walter had spent a lifetime in isolation, shunned by the flock. Now he had Scout, a motherless son, seeking a parent, discovering one in the most improbable candidate. They grew joined at the hip, and somehow they both became my family. Summer delivered sunshine and blooming pastures, but it also delivered the legal team of Preston Calloway. The court summons showed up in the heat of August. It was a stack of dense legal jargon alleging Harriet had lost her faculties, arguing that no sane woman would bypass her own blood to gift her legacy to an outsider. I sat in Vivian's office, scanning the pages with hands that refused to shake even as my pulse hammered against my ribs. Do they actually have a case? The foundation is thin, Vivian assured me. But remember what I warned you about. Preston has deep pockets. He can afford a war of attrition. He doesn't need a verdict to beat you. He just needs to bankrupt you. As if on cue, the bank sent their own notice that very week. It turned out Harriet had borrowed $15,000 2 years back to upgrade the farm equipment, a debt she'd been chipping away at faithfully. Now that burden sat squarely on my shoulders. If I missed a payment, the bank wouldn't hesitate to seize the land. That evening found me hunched over the kitchen table, surrounded by ledgers and a calculator trying to make the math work. The inheritance money had looked like a fortune initially, but between the daily overhead legal retainers and the loan notes, the balance was evaporating. The spring wool clip had generated a bit of cash, and the market lambs would add to the pot, yet the numbers simply weren't adding up. It wouldn't sustain me through a protracted legal siege, especially not if disaster struck. And naturally, disaster struck. September ushered in a nasty respiratory bug that tore through the herd. I had no idea where it originated. It could have hitched a ride on a borrowed trailer, a neighbor's boots, or even the wild deer grazing along the fence line. The how was irrelevant. The reality was a barn full of coughing, feverish animals fighting for every breath. For a fortnight, I barely saw the inside of the house, camping out in the straw to administer meds and check vitals around the clock. Dr. Bellamy made 3 separate trips to the farm, guiding me through quarantine procedures and tweaking the treatment lineup. "Don't blame yourself, Wren," she said one night, seeing the fatigue etched on my face. "Even the old hands lose livestock to outbreaks like this. It's how you handle the crisis that counts." Her words were kind, but they didn't stop me from feeling like I was failing Harriet's memory. 5 of them didn't make it. 5 creatures that looked to me for protection gone. I dug their graves near the tree line, right alongside Harriet's old pets. Afterward, I collapsed in the straw next to Walter, sobbing until I was completely hollowed out. That's exactly when Preston decided to reappear. He rolled up in his luxury sedan on a gloom-filled afternoon, catching me while I was mucking out the quarantine pens. I was covered in filth, running on 0 sleep and grieving, definitely not in the headspace for his games. He didn't care. "Word is, you've got a plague on your hands." He leaned against the hood, arms folded, regarding me with a look of faint amusement. "Terrible luck, truly. Why are you here?" "Same reason as always. I'm hoping you finally come to your senses." He fished a thick envelope from his blazer. $10,000, cash. Sign the rights over and walk away. We drop the suit. Take the payout and return to whatever hole you crawled out of. I stared at the packet he was offering. $10,000. I'd never held that much money at once. It was a fresh start, waiting to happen. A ticket out of this grinding poverty and endless stress. "It's a lot, isn't it?" Preston's tone softened, sounding almost paternal. "Probably more than anyone has ever given you. Just put your name on the line, and it's yours." I admit, for a split second, the temptation was overwhelming. I was so beaten down, so terrified of the looming failure. His logic seemed sound. Maybe I was an imposter after all. My gaze drifted past him, settling on the barn door. Walter was there, peering through the rails, his dark eyes locking onto mine as if he were waiting for my verdict. My mind went to Harriet, a fellow orphan from St. Catherine's, a woman who started with 0, who carved this life out of the dirt, and who decided to pass the torch to a stranger. Someone who knew the bone-deep ache of having nothing and the miracle of being given a chance. I imagined her reaction to a bribe like this. "No?" Preston looked surprised. "Excuse me." "I said no." I jerked a thumb toward the road. "Get off my land." His face went cold. "You're digging your own grave." "Maybe so, but it's my grave to dig." He slid back into the driver's seat and sped off. I waited until the dust cloud dissipated. Trudging over to the fence, I buried my face in Walter's thick fleece. "I don't know if I can do this, buddy," I murmured. He bleated softly, leaning his heavy warmth against my chest. We just stood there together as the sun dipped below the horizon. October brought the blow I feared most. The infection we thought was gone had been lurking in Walter's system. Being a bottle baby, his defenses weren't as robust as the rest of the flock. I saw the signs on a Tuesday morning. He was flat on the ground during grazing time, his breathing ragged, refusing food. Dr. Bellamy arrived within hours, her examination frighteningly silent and thorough. "His lungs are compromised," she admitted, finally avoiding my gaze. "The infection has taken hold." "What's the plan?" "Antibiotics, hydration support. Pain management." She hesitated. "Wren, I need you to be realistic here. A sheep in this condition." The vet was blunt. With an infection running this deep, the odds were terrifyingly low. I held back my tears, saving the breakdown for later. I just needed a timeline. If he could survive the week, there was hope. If not... The silence hung heavy in the air. I moved into the barn that night and refused to leave. I built a makeshift nest of quilts and pillows under the soft glow of a lantern curling up right there in the hay. Every hour, I dripped water onto his tongue, coaxing him to swallow. The quiet was suffocating, so I filled the space with my voice, rambling about the weather, the farm, anything to keep the fear at bay. I recounted stories about Harriet, reminding him how she had scooped him up when his own mother turned her back on him. I even spoke about the mother I never knew, the ghost who brought me into this world only to disappear without a trace. I have no memory of her face or the sound of her voice. I whispered to him that I understood the sting of being unwanted, of being left behind. "You aren't doing this alone," I murmured into his thick fleece. "I'm right here. I'm staying put. All you need to do is keep breathing, all right. Just keep fighting." By day 3, he refused food completely. Come day 4, his legs gave out and he couldn't even lift himself up. Day 5 broke me. I collapsed in the dirt next to him, weeping, certain I was watching the end of the only real family I had ever known. Scout refused to abandon his post. The little lamb huddled against his father, letting out soft bleats as if trying to transfer his own energy into the fading body. I sent desperate pleas into the darkness, not knowing if anyone was listening. Just please let him stay. He is my whole world. Then, on day 6, the tide turned. Walter's eyelids fluttered open and his gaze locked onto mine. It wasn't a glassy stare. He was really seeing me again, just like before the fever took hold. By the 7th morning, he was on his feet. 2 weeks in, he was back to grazing, drinking his fill, and shadowing my steps as if the illness were just a bad dream. Even the vet was baffled during the follow-up. She just shook her head, admitting that in all her years of practice, this was a first. "I've never witnessed a creature battle that fiercely for life," she said. But I knew why. He stayed because I begged him to. Because he knew I couldn't make it without him. Sometimes simply being needed is the cure. We nearly lost him, but he held on. It is proof that occasionally devotion outweighs biology. Perhaps those who have been cast aside are the ones with the strongest grip on survival. Have you ever cared for something so deeply you would move mountains to save it? Maybe a companion, a friend, or a vision everyone else called hopeless. Drop your experiences below. I read every single message. Also, hit that follow button if you haven't, because the discovery in the next chapter flips the script entirely. We are talking about a mystery buried under the floorboards and a message from a bygone era. Plus, a guest arrives to show us that kinship isn't defined by DNA. The real climax starts now. It was February 2 years into my life on this land. That court case was a dark cloud that wouldn't clear, draining my bank account like a parasitic infection. Desperate for a lifeline, I finally tackled the one chore I had been dreading, clearing out the cellar. It was a gloomy, humid cavern packed tight with 50 years of hoarding. Rusted tools, broken chairs, and dusty crates overflowing with documents and snapshots that time had forgotten. I was hunting for treasure, something valuable Harriet might have overlooked that I could pawn for quick cash. Instead, I stumbled upon a miracle. Tucked behind a wall of rotting cardboard sat a weathered, unassuming metal safe. I nearly walked right past it, but an instinct urged me to clear the debris, drop to my knees in the dirt, and attempt to crack it. The dial was stiff, seized up from years of neglect. Just as I prepared to walk away, a memory surfaced, Vivian mentioning that Harriet always stashed her critical papers close by. I rang Vivian immediately. "Try her date of birth," she suggested. October 7th, 1946. The tumblers clicked. The heavy door swung open to reveal a trove of legal files, deeds, bills of sale, and ledgers dating back to 1979 when the property first became hers. Every scrap of paper listed her as the sole owner. Then I noticed an envelope. Penned by hand 3 decades ago, it was a message to Harriet from a sibling I never even knew she had. The signature read, Thomas Calloway, the very man who was Preston's grandfather. It started with a simple greeting, "Harriet, I realize it has been an age since we last talked. You likely have no desire to read this, but I have to set this down on paper. The weight of my conscience is getting too heavy." He confessed to ruining their bond, admitting that envy over her achievements drove him to say unforgivable things. The real bombshell was in the final paragraph. "I need to state this plainly, just in case there is ever a dispute. That land belongs to you. You paid for it with your own hard-earned cash. It was never part of an inheritance. Mom and Dad left us with 0. You built that life from scratch. Nobody else has a right to touch it, and I will swear to that before a judge if I have to." Thomas Calloway had signed it, and right next to his name was an official notary seal. My hands shook as I gripped the paper, the magnitude of this discovery washing over me. Preston hung his entire case on the theory that the estate was an heirloom, implying Harriet was merely a custodian obligated to keep it in the bloodline, completely ignoring the written admission from his own grandfather that proved otherwise. I got Vivian on the line the second I knew. 3 weeks later, we were standing before the bench. The magistrate pored over the evidence, the deeds listing Harriet as the solitary owner, ledgers documenting every penny she spent, and that devastating missive from Thomas Calloway that hollowed out Preston's argument from the core. The opposition scrambled to object, grasping at straws by suggesting the letter was a fabrication. They begged for continuances and stalled for time. The judge shut them down at every turn. "The facts are indisputable," she stated, fixing her gaze on Preston. "Ms. Calloway purchased this land with her own earnings and labor. Her estate planning was hers to decide. Motion granted, case dismissed." The minutes following the gavel drop are a blur. I recall the warmth of Vivian's embrace and the wetness on my cheeks. I recall Preston tearing out of the chamber, refusing to meet my eyes. The drive home passed in a fog until I idled in the gravel, gazing up at a home that was finally irrevocably mine. Walter was waiting by the rails when I stepped out. I buried my face in his fleece, holding him tight. "We made it," I breathed against him. "We aren't going anywhere." The settlement covered the bulk of the attorney costs, and between the spring clip and the lambs supplied to the village bistros, I cleared the last of Harriet's machinery debt. By the fall of my second year, the crushing weight of insolvency had finally lifted. I was no longer clawing for air. I was ready to create. That first quiet summer offered the mental space to look past mere subsistence. That is when the project took root. Entering my third year, the war for the land was over, and I wasn't just holding my ground anymore. I was cultivating a legacy. My mind kept drifting back to the children at St. Catherine's, the ones who never felt grass under their feet or wind in the trees. I thought about what a sanctuary would have meant to my younger self, creatures that offer love without conditions. I dialed Administrator Holloway at St. Catherine's and pitched the concept. Sanctuary Saturdays. I proposed. A chance for the youth to meet the flock, breathe fresh air, and just exist. He was all in. "We have seen promising data on animal therapy," he noted. "Most of our charges have never left the pavement. It could change lives." We launched with a pilot group, 3 children and a chaperone. Honestly, it was a mess. Fear paralyzed some, while others acted out, tugging at fleece and chasing the herd until I had to step in. Those early weekends had me second-guessing everything. Then Walter took over. He possessed an innate wisdom regarding broken things. With the timid ones, he became a statue, letting them bridge the gap on their own terms. With the rowdy ones, he was a rock, unflinching against their noise and rough hands, radiating a stillness that eventually lowered the temperature of the whole group. Declan arrived with one of the first cohorts. 10 years old and already wearing the exhaustion of a man 3 times his age, he had the look of someone who stopped hoping long ago. He hovered on the periphery, silent and watchful, refusing to engage. Marlene, his foster mother, filled me in with a hushed tone. He had been with them for 6 months. Pulled from negligence, shuffled through 3 homes before landing here, he couldn't bring himself to believe this placement would stick. I crouched beside him as the hour wound down. "See that ram over there?" I gestured toward Walter, who was keeping vigil by the fence. "That is Walter. His own mother didn't want him. Refused to nurse him. The woman here before me, she saved him with a bottle and a warm stove." Declan stayed silent, but his posture shifted. The herd didn't want him either at first. They sensed he was an outsider, pushed him away. I let the words hang in the air. But he carved out a life anyway. He found a family, and today he is the heart of this entire operation. The boy studied the animal. "Can I touch him?" "Go ahead." I unlatched the pen, and Walter didn't hesitate. Then he offered a gesture I had rarely witnessed. He leaned his weight against Declan's ribs and simply rested there. Declan turned to stone hands trembling in the space between them. Slowly the dam broke. He buried his face in Walter's wool and wept. Beside us, Marlene wiped her eyes. I pivoted sharply, desperate to hide the wetness sliding down my cheeks. From that moment on, Declan became a fixture, showing up at the gate every second weekend without fail. He threw himself into the grunt work, tossing scratch to my new flock of hens, raiding the nesting boxes for breakfast, and combing the burrs out of Walter and Scout's coats. Words weren't his strong suit, nor were they necessary. We shared a silent language, a mutual understanding born from carrying the same heavy baggage. Marlene confessed later that night terrors used to plague the poor kid constantly before he found us. Yet, after a few months of farm life, the monsters apparently stopped chasing him into his sleep. For the first time in what must have felt like an eternity, he was actually resting until sunrise. He found an anchor, she told me, something solid that won't disappear on him. The mission expanded naturally from there, drawing in more broken souls. Hands reached out to help. Tessa, sporting a new engagement ring from Silas, took over the paperwork, hunting down grant money so we could widen our reach. We struck gold with a foundation dedicated to healing trauma in the foster system through therapeutic work. I brought Marlene on the payroll to manage the chaos, leveraging her background in counseling. Somewhere in the process, I realized the goal had shifted far beyond just rescuing a plot of land. I was constructing a sanctuary. Then, amidst the falling leaves of year 2, the mail carrier delivered another pivot point. The return address was a legal firm up in Portland, Maine, but the contents were personal, a handwritten script from a stranger named Celeste Calloway. She identified herself as Harriet's niece, Thomas's daughter. That meant she was the child of the very man whose written words had preserved my home. Celeste had been hunting for her lost aunt for years. She was raised on the lore of Harriet, the mysterious woman who vanished into the agrarian life the moment the state system let her go. Tragically, by the time she traced the deed to this address, Harriet had already been gone for months. She plucked my name from the probate documents and felt compelled to write. "I'm not looking for a payout," she assured me. Her final wishes were explicit, and I honor them. But I figured you might crave some history. Perhaps we could bridge the gap, seeing as Harriet makes us the nearest thing to kin either of us has left. Along with the prose came a stack of glossy memories. There was a youthful Harriet posing before this very farmhouse back when the siding was crisp and new. Snapshots captured her through the decades, perpetually solitary but always flanked by her flock. Then, the smoking gun, a black and white of a teenage Harriet, 15 or 16, lost in a crowd at St. Catherine's Home for Children. I didn't wait. I penned my reply before the sun set. I spilled it all. Walter Scout, the therapeutic work with the foster kids. I explained how I was striving to keep Harriet's spirit alive while carving out my own path. I left the door open for a visit. A fortnight later, she drove up with her husband Derek and their 2 sons, aged 7 and 9. I studied her reaction as she toured the grounds, noting the glassy look in her eyes when she stepped into the barn that had been her aunt's sanctuary. She ran her fingers across the kitchen table as if trying to absorb the lingering vibrations of the woman who once sat there. Celeste filled in the blanks, recounting how Harriet had faithfully mailed checks to her brother every Christmas, regardless of their silence. She spoke of a graduation ceremony where Harriet had appeared like a ghost in the back row, vanishing before anyone could offer a greeting. "She never raised kids of her own," Celeste murmured, "but she was always there watching us from the periphery. Her love was deep, just hidden." Derek spotted a sagging patch in the barn's roof and insisted on patching it up before the snow hit. Their sons became instant devotees of Walter and Scout, losing hours in the field while the livestock graciously endured the clumsy affection. "You've done her proud," she whispered to me before departing. It wasn't just about preserving the land, it was about the evolution of the place. It was about offering refuge to children who were just as lost as she had been. My throat closed up and my vision blurred. Once their taillights faded, I collapsed onto the porch stairs, Walter grazing at my boots and Scout nesting beside him. A realization washed over me, one I had been too terrified to accept. Solitude was no longer my reality. Then came Juniper. The moment I laid eyes on her, a familiar ache squeezed my heart. She was 11, fresh out of a neglectful home, undersized and scruffy, drowning in clothes that clearly belonged to someone else. She arrived with a cohort from St. Catherine's during my 3rd spring. She lingered on the fringes, refusing to engage, wearing a mask of absolute emptiness. I recognized that void. It was a shield, a necessary numbness for when you've learned that attachment is just a precursor to hurt. Once the schedule wrapped up and the others went to frolic with Scout, I spotted Juniper isolated near Walter's enclosure. She wasn't reaching out, she was just existing in his space. Walter stood guard on the other side, observing her with that ancient, soulful gaze of his. I lowered myself to the grass beside her, offering only my presence. We sat in the quiet for a few minutes until she broke the silence. "Is he all alone in there?" We lingered in the quiet for a long stretch. Eventually, she broke the silence, asking, "Is he out here surviving, all on his own?" She spoke in a whisper so faint it nearly slipped past me. "That's Walter," I told her gentle-like. "Poor guy was cast aside right after he was born. His own mama wanted nothing to do with him, so Harriet, the woman before me, took him in and bottle-fed him herself. The rest of the flock sensed he didn't quite belong, so they never really let him in." Juniper paused, letting that sink in. "He's all by himself then?" "Used to be," I admitted. "But these days, he's got Scout. He's got me, and he's got every kid who walks through that gate." I let the silence hang for a second. Finding your tribe can be a slow road, but just because you haven't found it yet doesn't mean it's not out there. She shifted her gaze, locking eyes with me. It was the first time she'd actually seen me since stepping foot on the property. "I don't fit anywhere," she whispered. The confession nearly broke me in two. "I get it," I murmured. "Felt like an outsider my entire life until I found this patch of dirt." "How'd you fix it?" she asked. I chewed on the question. How do you sum up 19 years of drifting, followed by the sudden, overwhelming grace of finally being home? "I quit forcing myself into spaces that were too small," I finally said, and I waited until I found a spot that was shaped just right. Her attention drifted back to the ram. "Is it okay to touch him?" "Go ahead." I unlatched the gate. Walter didn't trot over like he usually did for guests. He sank into the bedding instead, dropping low to meet her gaze, making himself appear as harmless and small as possible. She watched him for a beat, then crept forward on her hands and knees until she was nestled right up against his fleece. No petting, no fuss. She simply rested her weight against him and let her eyelids flutter shut. They remained frozen like a tableau for close to an hour, hardly drawing breath. When she eventually rose, her face was wet, but the ghost of a smile haunted her lips. She became a fixture after that, visiting weekly and making a beeline for Walter, whispering secrets to him that she couldn't trust to the grown-ups. I'd busy myself with chores within earshot, just keeping an eye out occasionally, chiming in if the moment called for it. Then one night, Rachel, her foster mom, phoned me up, sounding choked up. "She actually talked to me," Rachel said. "I mean, really opened up for the first time since she moved in. She told me the sheep's story, how nobody wanted him and how he eventually found his pack. Anyway..." The line went quiet, save for the sound of her stifled sobs. "She told me she wants to be brave like him, to keep moving forward even when the world turns its back on you." My knees gave out and I sank onto a nearby crate. It finally clicked, this was Harriet's grand design. This was why she bequeathed her life's work to someone she barely knew. Sometimes the only way to heal your own wounds is to bandage someone else's. Come fall of year 3, Juniper had become my right hand, with the ram grooming his coat, inspecting his feet, and measuring out his grain. She possessed an innate tenderness and a gut instinct for what the creatures needed, something you can't learn from a book. They spoke the same silent language. Even Scout, who usually kept his distance from folks, would happily trot alongside her through the fields. One whistle from her, and he'd come bolting over a privilege he didn't grant to another soul. Seeing her evolve from a frightened shadow into a girl full of grit and direction felt like looking in a mirror at my own recovery. It clarified the true weight of Harriet's gift. She hadn't just handed me a deed or a do-over, she'd given me a reason to wake up in the morning. That third Christmas on the land stands out as something entirely different from any holiday I'd known before. I gathered up the whole motley crew that had become my family. Hank showed up with his missus, who brought that legendary apple pie of hers. Tessa and Silas were their newlyweds as of that autumn, a wedding I'd blubbered through like a baby. Then came Opal with her husband and Dr. Bellamy with her whole brood. Marlene arrived with Declan in tow. The kid was 13 now and had shot up 6 inches in a single year. He was still a man of few words, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was the peaceful quiet of a boy who finally felt secure. Juniper walked in with Rachel clutching a card she'd crafted specifically for the ram. Celeste, Derek, and their boys rounded out the group, having made the long drive down from Portland to celebrate with us. The house was packed to the rafters, noisy as hell, and I wouldn't have changed a thing. Once we'd stuffed ourselves, we threw on our coats and trekked out to the barn. I'd rigged up some string lights and heaters so we could hang with the flock without turning into icicles. The flock was bedded down, calm and cozy. Walter and Scout held court in their corner by the office, observing the human commotion with a look that I could only describe as approval. Celeste hoisted her mug of steaming cider and called for attention. "To Harriet," she announced, "for carving this sanctuary out of the dust, and to Wren for keeping the heart of it beating and making it bloom into something even greater." We all took a sip. I felt the sting of tears threatening to spill, but I managed to blink them away. That's when Declan piped up from over by the pen. His voice was rock steady, stronger than I'd ever heard it before. "Landing here saved me," he admitted. "When I first showed up, I didn't trust a soul. Figured anything good was just going to get ripped away, same as always. But seeing Walter, he taught me that standing out isn't a bad thing. Sometimes the misfits are the ones who matter most." He turned his gaze my way. "Thanks for sticking by us." Juniper stood next to him, nodding in agreement as she stroked the ram's fleece. "He taught me that being different doesn't mean you're broken," she whispered. "Occasionally, the very souls who feel misplaced in the world discover they are precisely where fate intended them to be." Walter let out a gentle bleat as though he sensed he was the topic of conversation, and Scout chimed in a moment later with a louder, more demanding call. Suddenly, the entire flock erupted in a cacophony of baas that bounced off the rafters, forcing a collective, teary-eyed chuckle from the group. Later that evening, once the last guest had departed and silence reclaimed the farmhouse, I settled into the chair at Harriet's worn oak table. I imagined her perched here 1,000 times before balancing ledgers, fretting over finances, and scribbling down fragile hopes she was too afraid to speak aloud. Pulling a fresh sheet of stationery and a pen from the drawer, I began to compose a message of my own. To the soul who discovers this after my time has passed, understand that this place is far more than mere acreage and livestock. It is living testimony that redemption exists. It is proof that compassion reverberates through the ages, and that the castaways of society can construct a life of profound purpose if only granted a single opening. Harriet grasped this truth in her bones. She embodied it every day. Then, she bequeathed that mission to me, and I have endeavored to honor her legacy by offering sanctuary to children starving for the very acceptance I once craved. My goal was to provide a haven where they could finally shed their masks and realize that being unique does not equate to being damaged. If these words are currently before your eyes, accept that you belong here and believe that you are deserving of this refuge. Trust that a stranger held faith in you long before your paths ever crossed, and please maintain this cycle of grace. With love, Wren. With deliberate care, I creased the paper and tucked it inside the lockbox, nestling it next to Harriet's deeds and the note from Thomas. Stepping out into the biting chill of the December air, I looked up to find the constellations burning with impossible intensity over the fields. It was that piercing clarity found only in the deepest countryside where true night still reigns, and at the fence line Walter stood watch as if he had anticipated my arrival all along. I vaulted the rail and sank into the frosted turf next to him while Scout joined us immediately, wedging his warm bulk against my flank. Huddled together, the three of us held a silent vigil over the slumbering estate, gazing out across the meadows. Where the spring lambs would soon arrive, the barn that had absorbed decades of both heartache and triumph, and the farmhouse, its amber windows beaming a patient invitation for my return. My mind drifted back to the young woman I once was, 19 years old, and paralyzed by fear, sitting in an asphalt church lot, convinced my existence had ended before it had ever truly started. I reflected on Harriet, who had once been that same frightened girl, yet managed to alchemize her suffering into something magnificent. The faces of the children who had passed through these stable doors flashed in my memory. Declan, relearning how to rely on others. Juniper, finally speaking her truth. Scores of others whose names were etched into my soul. They arrived carrying shattered pieces of themselves and departed with their spirits made whole. All because a benefactor they never knew bequeathed her home to an outsider, and that outsider chose not to lock the gate. It was proof that love is not always forged by lineage, shared pasts, or duty. Occasionally, it is merely the active decision to nurture another soul simply because they require tenderness. When the following spring arrived, Juniper would finish middle school and petition to spend her entire summer laboring on these grounds. She would gain stature and resilience, her self-assurance unfurling like the perennials in Harriet's flower beds, while Declan began to voice ambitions of veterinary medicine. Dr. Bellamy would adopt him as a protege, allowing him to tag along on rounds and imparting wisdom that no textbook could ever offer. Our initiative would only widen its reach, bringing in more youth, facilitating more recovery, and demonstrating that a seed of benevolence once sown flourishes in unforeseeable ways. Celeste would return with her brood every holiday season, her sons adopting the farm as an alternate sanctuary, while Derek would instruct me on the finer points of roofing repair. We were destined to become the kin Harriet yearned for but never possessed, and through it all Walter would age with grace enveloped in affection. He would be attended by Scout, his constant shadow, by the children whispering secrets into his wool, and by me, the drifter who arrived empty-handed and discovered a universe. He would persevere until the age of 14, a positively biblical lifespan for a weather. When he eventually drifted away on a balmy April morning, I would lay him to rest adjacent to Harriet, high on the rise that commands a view of the valley. The marker I planted would read, "Walter, who taught us that distinction is a gift." But those days were yet distant. In the present, we simply existed together, the cast-off sheep, the discard girl, and the land that had rescued us both. I pressed my cheek deep into Walter's fleece, inhaling the earthy, comforting musk of him. "Thank you," I murmured into the cold air, "for all of it." He grunted softly in reply. It was the precise noise he had uttered the day our paths first crossed, when we were both isolated, terrified, and drifting a sound that translated to, "I am present. I acknowledge you. You are not solitary." I remained there in the darkness with Walter and Scout until the frost finally seeped through my coat. Reluctantly, I trudged back toward the homestead Harriet had raised from the dust, the home that now bore my name. A sanctuary that would eventually shelter another wandering soul in desperate need. Pausing at the threshold, I cast one last glance toward the barn. Home, I realized, it is far more than just coordinates on a map. It is a profound sense of peace, a certainty that your feet are planted on the right soil and you are part of a greater design. That was the legacy Harriet bequeathed to me. Today, my only wish is to pay that kindness forward. To everyone who has stayed with us through these final moments, please accept my deepest gratitude. Our community stands tall because of souls like yours. Those who champion redemption and recognize that true kinship is rarely defined by a genetic tree. You are the ones who realize that those with the most jagged scars often hold the greatest capacity for tenderness. If these memories resonated with you, I invite you to join our circle and pass this tale along to anyone who might need a little hope right now. I would be honored to hear your own journey in the comments. Have you ever stumbled upon a sanctuary where you least expected to find one? Has a sudden stroke of grace ever rewritten your future? Your voice has weight here. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for holding space for Ren, Walter, and Harriet, and for honoring the lives of every lost child who sought refuge on those acres. Until we speak again, carry this truth with you. There is a place in this world shaped specifically for you. You are cherished, and the path is always open to guide you back. Home.